I'm Gavin Clark with the National Museum of Computing and Reading Museum. We're interviewing former employees and customers of Digital Equipment Corporation as part of the 60th anniversary of DEC opening its first office in the UK. It's July the 2nd, 2024, and we are online. I'm here today talking to Peter Macfarlane. Peter, let's start with the basics, please. Please tell us your full name, your place, and your year of birth.
Hi, Peter Wilson Macfarlane. I was born in Glasgow, 1942. I went to Hindland Primary School. My father was a detective chief inspector in the City of Glasgow Police Force. My mother worked for the police force as a secretary, and that's how they met. I went to Hindland Primary School, then Hindland Secondary School in the West End of Glasgow, and that was only about 1 mile from the University of Glasgow, where I continued my education. I did mathematics, natural philosophy, graduated 1964, and then went to study for a PhD. Professor of Mathematics said that the Department of Cardiology at the Royal Infirmary was interested in automating the analysis of electrocardiograms. That's the electrical activity of the heart recorded with electrodes on the body surface. So in 1964, I went to the Royal Infirmary to start some research into this area. All I had at that time was literally a pencil and a paper, because none of the cardiologists knew anything really about automated ECG interpretation. They knew the concept, but they knew little beyond that. So I had to spend a lot of time studying medicine, studying electrocardiology, etc., and then beginning to think what sort of equipment would be required to take on the task. I was lucky enough to have a educational tour to the East Coast of the United States, and Washington in particular, where two American teams were looking at automated ECG interpretation. And at that time, I heard about this new laboratory desktop computer called the PDP-8. So I returned to Glasgow and was very enthusiastic about using this type of equipment for our research. At that point, we were using a rather large tape recorder to record the ECG signals. And that was really a bit clumsy. Everybody had to come to the laboratory to have their ECG recorded. Then we were very fortunate in that we obtained a grant from the Fraser Foundation, the late Lord Fraser of the shopping chain, and that allowed us to purchase a PDP-8. This meant that we could then take the ECGs from the magnetic tape, process them through the PDP-8, and end up with a digitized version of the ECG. Now, up until that point, I have been looking at a programming in something called algol to be able to, algorithmic language, to be able to interpret the ECG. But once we were able to purchase the PDP-8, then the opportunity arose to program all of the analysis within that specific computer. In the early days, there was a problem because the PDP-8 had a magnetic tape, which was very specific for use on that system. And we still had the early development of the program in algol on the university KDF9 system. So we had to find a way to transfer the DEC tape to the KDF9 tape. Now, as it happens, on my training course in Reading, I met someone who worked in Bristol building the Concorde, and he used DEC equipment, and he also had a KDF9 computer, and he told me he could switch our DEC tape data onto KDF9 format tape, and that was a real breakthrough as well. But it did mean sending the tapes down to Bristol by courier And then occasionally I would take a morning flight down to Bristol, pick up the tapes, bring them back to Glasgow. They were so important. We didn't want to trust them all the time by courier. So that was very, very interesting. It does remind me of the training course in Reading, when 11 o'clock every morning, the Concorde took off from Heathrow nearby, and we were virtually deafened in the classroom at that time during the training course, deafened by the Concorde. However, we proceeded to develop the software, and eventually we were able to have a complete interpretation of the ECG on the laboratory PDP system. Now, at that time, we were only able to use 3 waveforms recorded from the body surface, and that took about 1 minute for the analysis to be undertaken. 1 minute for 3 signals. The conventional recording of the electrocardiogram analyzes 12 waveforms. So we had to look at this in a different way, and we decided we could record the 12 waveforms in 4 groups of 3 leads. And so we gradually moved to that type of analysis. We had recording equipment, which was then able to go around the wards, just a small digital tape recorder, analog tape recorder, around the wards, and was able to record the full 12-lead ECG as required by the clinicians. They were much more comfortable looking at 12 leads than looking at just 3 leads. And then we gradually expanded the program. For example, many of you will understand that the heartbeat can be irregular, and as we get older, the probability of that increases. So we had to add logic into the program that analyzed heart regularity and irregularity, shall we say. And so by the end of the 1970s, we had a lot of experience of analyzing these ECGs. At that point, we were very fortunate in that we obtained further funding from the Scottish government this time, and that allowed us to purchase a PDP-11. And so processing times were much, much shorter for ECG analysis. Program was then adapted for the 12-lead ECG with all of these signals being recorded simultaneously. Instead of 4 times 3, it became 10 seconds of all the leads recorded simultaneously. Now, as it happened, there was a new extension being built for the Royal Infirmary, and representatives from Siemens Elima, based in Stockholm, came to the hospital to sell equipment, such as a cardiac catheterization lab. And when they were there, they said, "What else are you doing?" And we explained we were looking at ECG analysis. They came and had a look at it and said, "That's what we would like to have. We are developing a recording unit, but we do not have software for analysis of the ECG." I think, to be honest, at that time, they were looking towards support from IBM, who did have an analysis package. But clearly, it'd be better for Siemens Elima if they could take something that was not dependent on another large company. And so in 1981, a contract was agreed between the University of Glasgow and Siemens Elima in Stockholm. And that was the beginning of our link with the commercial world. And really up until this time, everything was done on a PDP series computer. So Siemens continued with the conversion of the software to work on their equipment. We continued development on the PDP-11. And in the late 1980s, then small ECG recording devices, electrocardiographs, came onto the market via Siemens Elima. And that was very satisfying. All the effort that we had put into this had become available essentially on a worldwide basis. Particularly so because Siemens purchased a company in North America called Burdick. This was in the late 1980s. And so they transferred our software onto the equipment that they've started to build in Wisconsin. And that then led to the software being introduced to the North American market. So there we are, around about 1990. The software is available in Solna in Sweden, in Stockholm, and also secondarily, it can be sold via Siemens or Burdick in North America. And so the University of Glasgow software became more widely known. And still, we processed all our work on the PDP-11 by this time in the early 1990s. There then came a stage where we wanted to expand internally. And I approached DEC, and particularly Mr. Jeff Shingles, who in fact had sold the first PDP-8 to me, and asked if there might be any opportunity for DEC to support our continued work. And one thing led to another, and perhaps after a year of negotiation and a link with DEC's factory in Ayr, in Ayrshire, only 30 miles from Glasgow Royal Infirmary, we were successful in persuading DEC to make a major contribution to the further development of our work. We, I think, received 10, 12 PCs and so on, and other associated equipment. So there really was a major contribution from DEC down in Reading, but supported by the local folks. In particular, a school friend of mine was a local sponsor, and he worked for DEC in Ayr. The principal of the university was so pleased with this award that he organised a reception for all those coming from DEC, lunch in the university, etc. And at the same time, if you'll forgive the joke, the principal was hoping DEC might fund a DEC chair of medical computing at the university, but it didn't quite work out that way. We were still very grateful to obtain the equipment. And things have continued to develop since then. Obviously, the trend for computers is downsizing, and so processing nowadays can be done on a laptop or a standard PC. And whereas we took 1 minute to analyze 3 signals in the late 1960s, we're now down to a situation where it's approaching 50 ECGs that can be analysed in 1 second on a reasonably powerful desktop PC or a laptop. So that really brings us up to date, except to say that the university has successfully licensed the software to over 20 companies worldwide now. The University of Glasgow ECG analysis program is, I would like to say, well known worldwide, all arising from the humble PDP-8 to the PDP-11, allowing us to develop the basic software and logic for the analysis. And it hasn't changed dramatically as far as we're concerned in all of these years. That kind of brings us up to the present time, where we have to be looking to see whether artificial intelligence can help our approach to ECG analysis, and that is where we'll be looking in the months and years to come.
Okay.
So that's just a little bit.
That's a really good overview, and it's good. It's really good. I mean, I also like the analysis, the bookending of how it started and how it ended. Just the power, computational power. Just you said a lot of interesting things there. If I can just take you back, you mentioned first of all the you studied mathematics and you heard this opportunity at the Royal Infirmary, this automation, computerization of ECGs.
Yeah.
You heard about PDPA in the States. Work computers. What was it like at the time? What obviously there were no computers in the medical field or in your particular area, and were other computers an option, or was it always PDPA at this point by the time they came to you?
Well, in North America, in Washington at that time, like almost the system in Glasgow and the university, the computing facilities were occupying something like the penalty area in a football pitch. I mean, there was no, that was the, in general terms, the size of the facilities that they had. One was in the US government department, and the other was in a Veterans General Hospital, probably less of a footprint in the Veterans General Hospital. The government computer, of course, was huge with all these magnetic tapes in place. So physically, the equipment was much, much larger at that time. And I did mention the PDP-11, but digital equipment were interested in its software at one point, and I certainly visited Maynard in Massachusetts and spoke to DEC about the possibility of using our software. But at the end of the day, DEC decided not really to get into the medical field. IBM were experimenting there, and they also pulled out of it as they decided it really wasn't appropriate for them because they didn't have the sales channels. I think that's the problem. They were selling computers. They weren't really selling they weren't geared to selling a medical application to medical staff.
So at the time, computers were huge. What were the computers you saw? You said you described these systems like as big as a gold mouth. Were they IBM computers or another maker's computers?
Well, the university was a KDF-9. I have a feeling that was ICL. I'm not 100% sure. Somebody would need to correct me on that one, but yes, it was a UK. It was definitely a UK system in the university. I'm not certain what was. I think it would be large IBM systems in the US facilities.
Mm. So University of Glasgow, sorry, the Royal Infirmary had a KDF. Is that correct?
No, the University of Glasgow had the KDF-9, and so any
Mm.
software that we developed, we had to take it across on punched cards and so on, and even paper tape to the university to put the input to the KDF-9 computer. It was rather primitive in those days, until we managed to get the tapes, the DEC tape and the KDF-9 tape problem sorted out. And then we just took the KDF-9 tapes to the university, having got them from Bristol. So that was how we solved that particular problem. But that KDF-9 tape was a couple of miles.
So did you have to use the PDPA in conjunction with the KDF machine? So the
Yes,
PDPA
yes.
did the digitization and
PDP-8,
the KDF did the computation.
yeah. Initially, the PDP-8 was an analog to digital converter. That is what it came to. And then gradually, more and more of the software got loaded onto the PDP-8, being transferred, the logic being transferred back from the university to the PDP-8. So it was written initially in algorithm, and then transferred back to the P. Yeah.
Or how did you could you have digitized the signals before the PDPA, or was there any
Well,
mechanism
we
to
didn't, we
digitize the
didn't,
audio signals?
we didn't get going until we had the PDP-8 to do the A to D conversion. As simple as that. So the very first PDP-8 we got was just a single cabinet that really two cabinets, a DEC tape and a main sort of processor cabinet. That was all we had. By the end of the day, we had discs added on at one end and so on, and we had a line printer stuck on at the other end. It was quite a large system that we had, physically large at that time, but still only within the confines of a small laboratory room.
So it must have been a huge step forward having this. I mean, obviously, how did having this PDPA change the game for you?
Well, it made it possible for us to develop the logic and acquire ECGs that could then be analysed, converted to digital form and analysed. Without that, we couldn't have proceeded. We needed to get that ECG signal converted into digital format, and that was the easiest way. We weren't electrical engineers. We needed something we could just use as a tool in order to get the electrical activity of the heart onto the digital tape. And then, of course,
And were other
over to
computers
university.
were other computers ever considered?
Not really, because DEC had the advantage of being within our budget and physically small, and that was a major or two major advantages at the time. I think it was only a few thousand pounds, but when you scale that up at the time, it was still reasonable price to pay for a computer.
That's interesting because a lot of people have said I've come across that before. This scale, the price point was very important, and the physical size of it was very important to research work because it was within budget and you could get it into relatively small spaces.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Fitted into the lab quite easily. When we got our PDP-11, by that time we had shifted to premises underneath what we like to call the only five-sided clock tower in Europe. It's an old building. It was formerly called the Blind Asylum as part of the Royal Infirmary complex, and we were given premises on the top floor. So when the PDP-11 came, a very, very large crane was employed to take the PDP from the ground outside the building up to the fifth floor and in through a window. That was nerve-wracking to watch that happen. But yeah, we were delighted to have the PDP-11. But otherwise there was only a small set of stairs, and on the other side there was the cardiac surgery ward. So anybody who had a valve replaced, then that was where they would be. So we couldn't come in through the other side. And then there was only a narrow set of wooden stairs. So this had to come up 5 floors on a crane and in through the window, even though it was still relatively small.
Tell me a little bit about go back to the PDP-8 just briefly. You said Jeff Shingles sold you that machine. Is that correct? How did that come about, and what was Jeff like?
Yeah, well, but having found out about the machine when I came back from that American trip, I then managed to locate digital in the UK, and that was, to my recollection, 11 Castle Street in Reading. And the head of department kindly provided a ticket for me to go down to Reading and speak to the company. And at that time, it was Jeff Shingles was the salesman whom I met. I still remember struggling to find DEC, and I was outside a furniture shop asking anybody if they knew where DEC was, and the address was 11 Castle Street. Finally, somebody said, "Oh, it's up the side street there and up the stairs." So my recollection is digital above a furniture shop in Reading, and Jeff Shingles was the chap that sold me that equipment, and so we were sort of knew each other from the earliest days of DEC being in the UK. Jeff Shingles and I knew each other, and as I said, we did remain in touch. And when we had that grant from DEC, it was Jeff Shingles who came to Glasgow along with to make the presentation, along with John Barrett, who was the Scottish service engineer for DEC at that time. John was very helpful to us as well, because in the early days there were limited numbers of PDPs in Scotland, so John was able to spend a bit of time with us on the machine, familiarising us with how to do this, that, make the odd repair.
That's interesting. If you can just pause there for a second. So just tell me a little bit. So I'm intrigued by you go down to Reading and you're struggling to find this shop. You wouldn't be the first person to say that. What were your impressions? Were you underwhelmed? Were you kind of wondered what you got yourself into?
Well, I suppose maybe I was a little bit surprised. But at the end of the day, I was just interested in obtaining a laboratory computer that we could afford. And for me, this was a giant step. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to complete my PhD at that time without that equipment. So I might not have been able to carry on the way I have done for the last few years. Maybe it's more than a few, without initially having the PDP-8 to get things going. So I was just
do you
only
remember the
too
office?
pleased.
I was going to say, do you remember the
Sorry,
office much? Can you remember the office much? What it looked like inside?
not in detail, but I vaguely there was just a collection of desks. It wasn't like some of the buildings that you might enter now in the commercial world or whatever. Just was basic space in an ordinary building, not specifically designed for high pressure sales or anything like that. Luxury furniture, just an ordinary set of premises. So nothing
Well,
too
it used to be a
grandiose.
bingo hall. No,
Oh,
it
did
used
it?
to be a bingo hall, and yeah. So I'm curious to see if any of that kind of
Bingo
hangover
hall.
was still there. Like, yeah,
Well, I don't remember. I'm sorry. I never thought I was going to a
okay.
bingo hall. No, no,
You might
not
have
at all.
reconsidered. Do you think? And what was? I'm just curious. The impression of Jeff. I mean, obviously, I'm curious the fact you went down there rather than they came to you. How did the meeting? Any recollections of the men of the meeting itself, and the conversation, and what was Jeff like?
Well, we're looking back 1965, 66 to 2024. So I'll leave you to calculate the number of years in there. 64 to 24 is 60 years. So it's 60 years next month when I first went to the Royal Infirmary. So it's Jeff was always very pleasant, no question about that. Very easy to speak to and to deal with. And the best of my recollection, not pushy in any way. I think there was fairly definite likelihood that we would obtain the PDP-8. I wasn't aware of any competition, so there didn't need to be any hard sell, shall we say, for us to buy the PDP-8. The pressure was on us at our end to obtain the money. And it was fortunate that someone in Scotland actually donated the money to the British Heart Foundation. And so it became a British Heart Foundation award. It was actually called the Fraser Award. So the pressure was really on us to get the money and not really on DEC in any way, I would say.
Were they
So, and
excited to get
Jeff,
your
well,
Were they excited to get your custom at all? Do you think?
Well, I think so. I mean, the company were relatively new to the UK and very new to Scotland. So sure, very excited, I'm sure. I'm not sure whether we were the second or I don't think we were the first PDP in Scotland, but we were certainly, I think, in the first five, even first three systems to come to Scotland. So that's why John was able to help us in the early days, because the systems weren't failing every day. The great thing about the PDP-8 was, after a few months and learning a bit more about it, it was quite possible for the user to say there's a fault and track down the fault and say, I think it's this board, pull out the board. And we did have several spare boards, put in the card, and the machine was working again. I don't think I could do that. Impossible to do that now. You don't have cards that you lift out and put in to operate a computer. It's like lifting the bonnet of a motor car nowadays. You wouldn't know where to begin. 40 years ago, you maybe knew what to do, but not now. At least I'm speaking for myself, but I lift the bonnet of a motor car now, and that's interesting, isn't it? I can top up the water, but beyond that, it's complete no-go area.
No, I agree. What do you think? In John Barrett is interesting. Now, obviously, DEC prided itself on its degree of customer service, and as you point out, there were relatively few PDP8s in the country. Never mind Scotland as a whole. What would
Yeah.
John? So John, and he became head of service. What would John? How did it go down? You would call John. We got a problem, and what kind of things would he do to the computers?
Yeah. Yeah, it was fairly direct. It wasn't like you placed a call with London and somebody said, I'll try and find an engineer to help you. It was, I recollect, more or less a direct phone call to John. And he lived sort of halfway between Glasgow and Edinburgh to be relatively central to the two major cities. And at the same time, in the middle of the country, you can escape north and south relatively quickly should the need arise if more systems came into being. So John was able to respond very quickly in the early stages when there were few systems, just a direct phone call and he said, I'll be in as soon as I can. When I finish something else, I'll be there. So John was very, very helpful. And so we still remember each other, shall we say, and emails have been exchanged, particularly recently, of course, on account of the digital revolution, as you're calling it.
What kind of problems were they? Was it
So,
reliable?
yeah.
Was it what kind of issues might come up with the PDP-8?
Oh, yes, it was. The machine wasn't breaking down every day. Not, no, not at all. Not at all. Um, but and we were in the learning curve as well. And if you're inputting an analog signal and you don't think something's coming out and as a digital signal correctly, maybe for us some of that would be pretty tricky to find if you thought there was a problem. I mean, if the machine just failed, then that was probably a much more easy problem to solve. But I never knew John unable to solve anything. And if the part weren't immediately to hand, it usually appeared overnight by courier and would be back in the next day with any part. Just a small postcard-sized part that slotted in to the rack. I'm sure you'll be familiar with all of that from speaking to others. But there was never a great problem with breakdown, like we were stuck for 2 weeks or maybe most one day till a part arrived.
I suppose were you kind of aware
But it
what you were
was,
achieving? Because you it was a great, compared to today's standards, it's quite small processing, but you were making great leaps at the time. Were you aware of what you were kind of getting into with the PDPA, what you were achieving?
possibly not. I mean, now we believe it was the world's first mini computer service for ECG interpretation. Okay, in Washington, you had your giant sized systems. And I know there were others in the Netherlands, still good friends, who were similarly began to develop their system. But I believe we were the first that were routinely running a reporting system, ECG analysis system, inside the hospital. And in fact, we recently published a small book which we call Royal First, of all the things that first happened in Glasgow Royal Infirmary. And that goes way back to Joseph Lister and antiseptics to prevent wound infection and so on, treat wound infection. So in that book, we have put the booklet, we've put the PDP-8 system as being the world's first mini computer system routinely working inside a hospital. But we didn't, at the time, this book's just come out about 2 months ago. At the time, we didn't really think of it like that. We had no idea the system would take off and be used worldwide. And so, I mean, we have to thank the DEC and the PDP-8 for getting us going. But, I mean, as I say, the university has licensed the software now to over 20 companies worldwide, and some of these companies are in China, some are in North America, some are in India, and some are in Europe. So it's a pretty worldwide use of the software nowadays from these humble beginnings, shall we say.
I, as you do, I suppose the question for someone like myself outside of the field, what was it letting you do that would not be possible before? Are you now, for the first time, able to diagnose heart conditions, to understand the condition? Is the data analysis getting faster? What outcomes are you achieving that were not possible before?
Well, we weren't turning electrocardiography upside down, shall we say. We were automating the procedure of interpreting the ECGs. Really, ECG interpretation is best undertaken by a cardiologist, but not everybody, as you can well understand, is a cardiologist. So what we were trying to do is help those without that special expertise in cardiology to have a reasonably good guide to the interpretation of the ECG. We like to say it's a second opinion. We never tell a cardiologist that this is much better than you are at interpreting ECGs. And there can be differences from one physician and cardiologist to another, and everybody knows about the term second opinion. And sometimes you can have a second opinion as to what an ECG is showing. So not we would not claim to be changing electrocardiography. Nowadays, if we're looking at 1924, the situation is changing a little bit with the use of artificial intelligence to comment on the ability of the heart to contract the way it should, shall we say, without going into anything in the way of clinical details. But that is using the ECG to report on almost a mechanical part of the action, or one of the functions of the heart, of course, is to pump. And more recent work with AI approach is showing that the ECG can be used to give an indication of how well the heart may be pumping. I have certain concerns about it. I think it can only be used successfully in a very small section of the population where you might be interested in that finding and being abnormal, but you can't use it as a screen for the whole population. Not at all. Not at all. But that's the beginnings of just a different way of using an ECG. And somebody sitting here 20 years from now may be able to say, well, that was the beginning. Look what we've done now. But so that's another start of another little branch of electrocardiography. We'll be interested. We are linked. I should say we are linked with that with one company. Sorry.
Do you think were you getting interest from other institutions for the work with the PDPA? Was it drawing interest from other your colleagues and peers elsewhere?
Oh yes, I mean we presented the work at conferences, and in 1974 I was sponsored by the European Union to tour Europe for 4 weeks and study and visit other labs that by that time, the mid-1970s, they were beginning to show an interest in developing their own approaches to ECG interpretation. That's the way things go. Medicine's like that. Somebody does something one place and then all of a sudden everybody else is trying to replicate it. But there were half a dozen places or so in Europe, and that led to the formation of a large project that lasted from about 1976 to 1991. And that was called Common Standards for Quantitative Electrocardiology. And through that collaboration with everybody, and we eventually brought in one or two folks from North America with a major interest, we developed standards for the whole technique. And these are still accepted today. There's a 1985 publication and so on. So that was shortened to the CSE study. And so that lasted, in 1976 to 1991, The final results published in the top journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, 1991. And then, unfortunately, the project leader, Joss Willems, he died from a brain tumor shortly after. But he had overseen that whole project for 15 years or so. So yes, we collaborated with different folks. It was a great time, in fact, to have regular meetings all around Europe to discuss. It was hard work. I mean, we lost being on the committee. Sort of every quarter there was a weekend lost, Friday to Sunday night, at meetings of the group to take things forward. So it's not all plain sailing. It's been a lot of hard work to get to where we are nowadays.
No, I can believe it. Just tell me a little bit. So we discussed the PDPA in great detail. The PDP 11 now starts making an appearance, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What was the circumstances? You go right. We got to. What drove the decision to go from the PDP 8 to the 11?
Well, I didn't say much about it, but on the PDP 8, everything, to my recollection, we were using machine code, and then 12 switches on the front to decode and look for any problems. You were just toggling a switch on the front of the PDP-8, to add two numbers. You clear the accumulator, TAD A, TAD B, and set the result equal to C, or set the result in C, that kind of thing. And we moved to the PDP-8, and the program was rebuilt in Fortran. So it had gone from really preliminary work on ALGOL in the university, algorithmic language, to the machine code. They expanded it in machine code in the PDP-8, and then up to Fortran on the PDP-11. And so when we were commercializing with Siemens, initially we were in Fortran, and then a decision was made to move to C. And so the program has transitioned through many languages, but the PDP-11 was the big step into Fortran, and really helped a great deal to structure the code in a relatively reasonable fashion. And
so what drove the decision? Was it you needed more processing power, or you thought the application had to move on, or your requirements have now outgrown the PDP-8?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit pragmatic. Who wants to program in machine code if you can program in something like Fortran or C or whatever it is you wish to use? So the major decision was the PDP-11 allowed that as a much more powerful computer than the PDP-8. That's the way things go. And so we were delighted to move upwards to the PDP-11 and stick with the DEC laboratory size equipment. No question about that. We are just a small department in a big hospital, so that equipment fitted in very nicely.
What happened to the old PDP-8? Did it get chucked away? Do you know? Did it get saved?
It didn't get saved, unfortunately, but it was fairly big. We maybe have a board, a little PDP-8 front panel somewhere. It's still in the lab, I think, in a corner. Our own private museum, which is one or two odds and ends, and still going back to the PDP-8. But no, it was too big to keep in the department. Just had to go, I'm afraid. But there we are.
Okay.
The other thing that
so you're on the PDP-11. Come.
Yep. Sorry, I was just going to say, the other thing just I could mention is that with the availability of the small ECG machine, it could go to the bedside, it could make an interpretation on the spot at the bedside. It could also transmit the ECGs digitally. That allowed us in 1989 to start a big study called the West of Scotland Coronary Prevention Study. And that was a study for men over 45 who had not had a heart attack, but they were at risk. And half of them were given a statin, and I think most folks will know about statins to reduce the probability, reduce the incidence of heart disease and heart attacks. And half were given a placebo. And we ran that study for 6 years with ECG machines all over the west of Scotland, transmitting in to the centre, and showed that statins did in fact decrease the probability of having a heart attack. I have to put a wee medical hat on for a minute, but the statins did reduce the heart attacks. And so that the nice thing about that was a big study run in Scotland with international implications. And in our case, Glasgow software, all inside a small machine, immediate interpretation, but also transmitted in centrally. And I think I had to review 6,000 and odd men in the study for 5 years. I reviewed about 30,000 ECGs just to check them all going into the study database. So from the beginnings with that PDP-8, we're linking right through to sort of major clinical studies being carried out with worldwide implications relating to reduction in the incidence of heart attacks and so on.
So it's definitely changing, pushing the medical frontier back out, isn't it? The use of the PDP-8 and the PDP-11.
Well, it did at that time, and then there were other complementary studies. We carried on, and we did a similar study in the elderly. That was called PROSPER, Prospective Study of the Elderly at Risk, ER, and the PROSPER Elderly at Risk. And that was Scotland and Ireland down in Cork. It was centred in Cork in Ireland, and Leiden in the Netherlands. And again, we showed the statins, those who took statins had fewer heart attacks and so on. So it applied to young folks, it applied to older folks. And there were other studies beginning with different types of statins. Our statin was pravastatin, but there are many other statins now being used for the same purpose.
Are you finding, I suppose, obviously a lot more work's being done. Do you find the application is becoming more sophisticated, the workload, the data load is getting bigger, more sophisticated, the application is getting bigger, more sophisticated during this time?
Well, there's more facilities to help move things forward. For example, there's the UK Biobank has maybe 60, 70,000 ECGs there. We were not involved in collecting ECGs for the biobank, but the ability to store them digitally and so on, and then follow these patients for 10, 20, 30 years will definitely lead to establishing maybe some indices that can predict what the outcome with certain patients will be. But it's all due to automation and so on and so forth.
I'm curious.
So yeah,
tell me
the digital.
So I was going to ask. Sorry to interrupt. I was going to ask you, when you got the PDP-8, it started a very simple role. It was that conversion of the analog signal to the digital. By PDP, even during its lifetime, its role changed. How has the role now changed by the time of PDP-11? It's no longer involved in that simple function, is it? It's now doing much more sophisticated work.
Yeah, because by the time we had the PDP-11, one of our, I'm jumping around, I know, but one of our medical physicists had actually designed a machine that did allow us to record all leads simultaneously. And that was another function that the PDP-11 was handling, all leads being acquired simultaneously. And certainly with Siemens in Sweden, they also moved to all leads being recorded simultaneously. And so they were, the PDP-11 was able to handle that, no problem at all. And of course, the runtime by then had come crashing down. I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure By that time, it was about an analysis was about 1 second, whereas now it's 50 per second. The way things have gone, but speed's not a great concern. Whether it's 50 a second or 100, unless you're going to be looking at 1 million ECGs, and then the runtime is shorter. And some people do look the big databases now and AI techniques. Some people do look at the order of 1 million, 2 million ECGs with the convolutional neural networks, etc.
And how's the relationship going with DEC at this point? Are they still in touch? Are you still getting? Is John Barrett still coming up to fix things, or have things moved on a little bit since those days?
Well, John, we don't have a PDP or a PDP-11 for John to fix, I'm afraid. So I think the days of service engineers coming in to look at a laptop are probably gone. That's for sure. If you're talking about large central systems in big corporations, that's a different story, which I don't know anything about. But in our world, nobody comes in to service a laptop. It's such that you have maybe three. Everybody has one or two PCs they're working on, and our software development manager will have 3 or 4 systems stretched out to work on, and we do not have any service engineer of any sort these days to look at the computing equipment. Problems tend to be on the networking side, and that's a different thing altogether. That's where most of the difficulties come, linking to the university and the fire.
How was it with the PDP-11?
Yeah.
With the PDP-11, was DEC still supportive? Were they still coming out to support you in the PDP-11 phase?
Oh yes, if necessary, yes. They did that, but I think the PDP-11 was probably more. Well, the PDP-8 was still reliable. John wasn't in 5 days a week. John Barrett servicing the PDP-8, not at all. My recollection would be that PDP-11 was even less prone to failure. I don't really recollect many visits by anybody coming up to that lab on the 5th floor where the machine was installed with a crane, but I little recollection of the PDP-11 presenting any problems. More likely to be, say, a printer.
And tell me about your work.
Sorry.
And you were coding as well. So I was going to say, you were coding as well. You're building applications. It was interesting your comment there about you were developing the software. So you're kind of coding on the PDP-11 as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I tended to work out a lot of the logic, the clinical side of things. I mean, in the early days when I'd gone straight to the cardiology from the university, there was no equipment. So I had 2 or 3 years learning medicine, studying medicine, going into all the places, theatres and so on and so forth, picking up what I could, attending the clinical meetings every Saturday morning at 10:30 and so on. That doesn't happen. Certainly locally, that doesn't happen any longer. People are too busy. They need a bit of a rest when they can. So I was able to assist with designing the logic, and often that was passed over to someone else to code. And nowadays, I don't code in any way. I concentrate entirely on a logic being developed when it's needed, or if there happens to be if the system, we feel the system could have done better, let's have a look at it and see how we can improve the logic here to sort it out. And new patterns do come in, and certainly I was also been very interested in the effect of age and ethnicity or race on ECG appearances. We've done studies in India, in China, or Taiwan, looking at in Nigeria. I had a professor of cardiology came and studied with me for a wee while. And we can see changes in different racial groups. And we built that into our software. And these criteria, with age and sex particularly, have an effect on certain patterns of the ECG. And we built that in, and that is now part of the international guidelines for determining a heart attack from the ECG. It's not the only way to determine a heart attack, but it's a contributory factor to the various bits and pieces that go together to say, yes, this patient has had a heart attack. So, yeah, from my personal point of view, coding, I keep away from that now and leave that to those who really know what they're doing.
But it must have been an interesting experience. I mean, you're in the field of medicine. You came to it through mathematics. You're in medicine, and yet you're coding. And for the 70s and I guess the 80s, you've got a department that's coding the application in a medical field. Yeah. Does that kind of make you feel, I suppose, different or distinct to what's happening around you in any way?
Yeah, I enjoy, in a way, being a link. I'm happy to discuss anything, shall we say, with a cardiologist. I'm happy to discuss anything with a software development manager. I'm kind of in between the two. Ultimately, I was lucky to be given a fellowship with the Royal College of Physicians for my sins. So I'm just kind of in between the two different professions, and I'm in no man's land with probably no. I don't know what my profession is. Chatterbox. Oh, sorry.
What? Well, I think it's interesting because a lot of people would they see coding in a very detached way from the real world. So it's interesting to hear that you were working on it in this particular aspect. It kind of puts coding in a new light, I think.
Yeah. So I've enjoyed the role very much. Being a kind of link between two different professions, shall we say. Maybe it's a little bit unique, but I think now the younger students in any discipline have come up through their mobile phones and apps and all the rest of it, iPads, whatever it is. Everybody's got a kind of basic computing understanding. I would like to think most folks have a basic understanding of computing, maybe not of programming, I must admit. Whereas I think if you go back to early 1970s, that was a different world altogether. So there's no question. But now it's irrelevant. But when I watch my grandson with two thumbs going at 100 miles an hour, and I'm plodding along with one finger. I've got a pen now, electrostatic pen. But I say, different world.
I suppose, what was the question for you? You obviously, you came to it through mathematics. Did you, and computers back then were very much, hardly anybody knew anything about them. What, were you aware of computers and computing? Obviously you went to the States, you saw the PDP-8 and you had the KDF at the university. Did you ever generally an interest in computers or computing or technical or engineering at that point in your life?
Not really. I mean, I did even the maths, and I did physics. They do call it physics nowadays as opposed to natural philosophy. We weren't using computers in any way whatsoever in these classes. You couldn't possibly consider doing a maths degree with a computer to hand in those days. I mean, that was proving that 1 and 1 was 2. You wouldn't believe it, but the proof of 1 and 1 being 2 was an incredible piece of work. Don't ask me to do it now. And so computing just wasn't there at all. And KDF9 was a centralized facility for the whole university at that time, 1965, 66. And then Physics, no, these simple laboratory experiments were nothing to do, no computing in the laboratory at that time, for us anyway, as students. Of course, things have taken off since then dramatically. Physics in Glasgow is famous for just this last.
Tell me a little bit about your.
Sorry, I'm just going to say physics.
Sorry, the reception's really bad.
Yeah. Physics, I'm saying the physics in Glasgow, math as well, but physics was well known. Even just this week, it's 200th birthday of Kelvin, minus 273 degrees absolute. So the university's been celebrating Kelvin this week. But there we are. Last week, not this week.
To just go back a little bit, I've got a couple of final questions for you. One is, you mentioned you had training in Reading back in the early days.
Yeah.
Tell me, look, what do you remember about your training? And that was for the PDP-8. Was that when you were still very new to DEC? Was it a classroom? How did it go? Was it intensive? What did you learn?
Yeah, well, there could have been the order of 10, 12 people in a modest-sized room. And it was just the basics of how to program PDP-8. I mean, from knowing nothing about laboratory computing, you had to pick up quite a lot. And I joked earlier about TAD A, TAD B, put A into zero the counting register, add in a number, add in another number, put the answer out somewhere else. We had to go back to the real basics like that. But there were different courses, of course. I mean, there's a basic introductory course, and then there were other courses for different aspects of computing. So I'm sure I went to 2 or 3 different courses. It's a wee bit vague now, I'm afraid, but certainly had to go for a basic course on how to handle the PDP-8 programming.
And were they like large classroom settings? Was there a teacher? Or was it pen and paper? Was there computers on the desks? How describe the scene?
Oh yes, oh yes. There was a teacher lecturer, without a doubt, telling us what to do, and there had to be facilities to use the PDP-8 at the time, without a doubt, to familiarise ourselves, so that going back on the Friday when the course was finished, you knew what to do in the Monday morning. And there was really nobody else to turn to. Certainly in my case, there was no one else to turn to help. So you just learned trial and error and gradually picked up the ability to program. Of course, there had to be functions somehow or other, or routines or procedures, goodness knows what, to multiply. But again, it's just a different style of programming at that time.
Did you go back for other training throughout the years back to Reading?
Yes, there could have been, say, 1 year down the line, some kind of advanced programming, if I remember correctly. But it certainly wasn't sort of once a month for another training course. No, but it was perfectly adequate. The courses that were run at the time, they were fine. Helped to get me through. And then other people came along.
Sorry, I was going to ask. Just tell me a little about how the relationship with DEC progressed over the years. You'd mentioned that obviously there's in Scotland you had a managing director, Dave Lawrence, up there for DEC, and there was he was the manager of AIR. There was a relationship between the DEC factories up there and local research universities. And you mentioned the grant which you had received as well. Just tell me what was the kind of relationship like between you particularly and any other individuals from DEC? How did it go up there?
Well, the main link was via John Barrett as the service engineer, who was in the department more than anybody else, clearly, through the years. Jeff Shingles would be in touch occasionally, and then with my school chum in Ayr in the factory, there was a further link established there, and I do remember the you referred to Dave Lawrence, that and he invited me. The company through him sponsored one of the games for Ayr United. It's the local football team a few miles from the DEC factory. And I happen for my sins to support. I've always supported Ayr United. I'm still daft enough to support Ayr United. But he invited me to that game that DEC had sponsored. And so very nice to have a cup of tea and a sandwich in the boardroom. I'd never been in the boardroom, very small boardroom at the ground. DEC paid for the match ball and so on, raffle tickets and so on and so forth. So there was a link like that. That was on one occasion, on an occasion of the way that DEC looked after customers, shall we say. Jeff, when the, maybe repeating myself, but when the award was made, I applied and really was playing the card that Jeff had sold me, the initial PDP, hoping he would remember. And he did remember. And so from that point of view, we're very fortuitous to have that link. And it did a lot in making the grant available to us, that there was a personal link between me having gone to the factory, the sales room in Reading, and Jeff was up once or twice at that stage to finalise a sale. He came up to Glasgow to finalise the sale and so on. So we've had that link with Reading. We've had the link with Ayr, the factory in Ayr, and John as a service agent. So we've been very well supported by DEC all these years. I'm just sorry that the relationship came to an end, but there we are. We all move on.
What? Just tell me briefly about the grant. What was the grant for? What were you able to get from the grant, using the grant?
Well, the group expanded in number because the software had been taken up commercially. The group was expanding, and we needed more facilities for the team. So, and to replace older equipment. So that grant enabled us to replace, I think, everybody's equipment at that time. And we must also have had a new central upgraded PDP-11, I think, at that time as well. So it was a substantial award, and it included maintenance of all of that, I think, for at least the following year. So that gave us a bit of consolidation at the time, that we weren't looking, having to go out for more grant money to try to keep us up to date with facilities. And it's always the same in any university lab. You're always wanting to do something new, get more equipment in, keep up to date. And DEC certainly fulfilled that role by assisting us at that time.
Well, it's great. They certainly had it seems like they definitely had a sense of community involvement and supporting causes, didn't they? And engagement with communities.
Oh yeah, I mean the football match is a case in point. The local company was sponsoring the game, the team and that particular match. I think if they were there now, there'd be a much bigger involvement of DEC with Ayr, because they're much more keen now to involve the local community. In fact, Ayr United were awarded a European honour as being the best community, organised team in Europe just about a year ago. Unbelievable. So maybe DEC added to that in the early days, contributed to that in the early days, this link with the community.
What do you think? Do you have any thoughts, I suppose, finally on DEC's legacy? Of you had a very specific relationship with them, and very specific individuals. The company has now no longer exists. We know the history. Do you have any thoughts, I
Yeah.
suppose, on does it have a legacy? What is its legacy for you or personally or for the world?
Well, for us, they provided a basic stepping stone, or the first step in the ladder, shall we say, that we have climbed since that time, the mid to late 1960s. Very definitely gave us that first step, maybe even the second step, and so on, with PDP-11s coming in to help us. Just helped us to climb up the ladder to sort of international acknowledgement of the University of Glasgow ECG analysis software. So very definitely, for us, Dick made a major contribution to what has subsequently occurred. No question about it. So for that,
I suppose is there a line you can draw, like its impact on cardiovascular research as a whole?
well, yes, I've referred to the West of Scotland coronary prevention study with the machines out all over the West of Scotland with our software inside, thanks to the basic building blocks being put in place by DEC. And that at its time, we were trained, shall we say, to say it was, a great study for. It laid a lot of the foundations for statins being used. Landmark trial leading to statins being used widely, worldwide, in the prevention of heart disease. So it's another that was further up the ladder, but that, as I said, DEC gave us the first 2 or 3 steps up there, leading to that sort of result with this landmark trial. And as I've said, many other statins are now out there. All the companies then rush to produce a statin, and maybe pravastatin's not used so widely now, but still think it's a very safe statin to be used.